Good morning and good evening. Good evening, particularly from our friends from Asia that has joined us this morning. And welcome to the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. I'm Indu Saxena, Chief Operation Officer and Senior Fellow at the Consortium. Today, welcome to today's book talk, and it's a very important title of this book in the context of current geopolitics, Indo-Pacific geopolitics. So title of the book today we are going to discuss is Japan's Grand Strategy, Liminal Power in an Uncertain World. In this discussion, I am joining with the co-editor of this book, in fact, the series of the Oxford Grand Strategy, Professor Reich, and fortunate to have the authors of this book here, Professor Saori N. Katada and Associate Professor Dr. Koga. Professor Saori N. Katada, she joined us, has joined us in this morning from Tokyo, and Dr. Koga has joined us from Singapore, right? And so before diving into the substance, please allow me to introduce a little to our panelists, today's panelist and chair. We know they have a very renowned reputation in academics that you can just type their names and then everything will be there. But as a protocol, I have to do this. Professors, so we have Saori N. Katada. She is a professor of international relations and director of the Center of International Studies at the University of Southern California. A prominent scholar of geoeconomics, she is a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research and has served as a vice president of the International Studies Association. Her notable work includes Japan's New Region Reality in 2020, an analysis of Japan's geoeconomic strategy, Banking on Stability in 2001. She co-authored the works on the BRICS and Collective Financial Statecraft in 2007 and Taming Japan's Deflation in 2018. She has also published 6 edited and co-edited books, 2 books in Japanese, and numerous articles in the subject of trade, financial, and monetary cooperation in East Asia, as well as Japanese foreign. Welcome, Professor Katada. We have Dr. Koga. Dr. Koga is Associate Professor at the Public Policy and Global Affairs Program, School of Social Sciences, Nanyang Technological University, NTU in Singapore. And I'm fortunate to have another discussion 2 years ago. Hope you remember Professor Koga. And then he is a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research and member of Research Institute of Peace and Security, RIPS, in Japan. His research focuses on international security, international regional institutions, particularly ASEAN, and East Asian and Indo-Pacific security. Welcome, Dr. Koga. Last but not least, we have the co-editor with us, Professor Simon Reich. He gracefully accepted my invitation to moderate or to chair this session, to steer this session. Simon Reich is a professor at the Division of Global Affairs and Department of Political Science at the Rutgers, Newark. He also holds an appointment of Chercheur Associate and Center of International Studies at Sciences Po, Paris. Prior to his Rutgers appointment, he spent over 2 decades at the University of Pittsburgh, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, including the founding and serving as the inaugural director of the Ford Institute of Human Security. Professor Reich now serves as the co-editor of the Oxford Studies in Grand Strategies book series. Welcome, Professor Reich. And before I hand over to you, just an announcement that the opinion and the views are expressed here are personal, should not be construed to any organizations and institutions. Thank you all. And Professor Reich, over to you.
Thank you, Indu, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. I'm delighted to participate in this particular event. It's close to my heart because I have, for the last several years, with Thierry Balzac and Peter Dombrowski, been co-editors of the Oxford series on grand strategy. Uh, we published by Oxford University Press. Uh, to give you some sense, the book series is devoted to individual country studies from a variety of different theoretical perspectives, a variety of different methodological perspectives, but looks at the historical bases and contemporary challenges posed by what we would generally construe as being middle and small powers. So it rather runs against the tide of convention, which tends to look at the grand strategies of great powers. The first book published in the book series was on Swedish grand strategy, and I'm delighted that the second book published in the series is this wonderful book on Japan's grand strategy by the authors from whom we'll hear today. Forthcoming volumes, just to give you a sense, include studies of German grand strategy, the EU as a grand strategic actor, which is obviously a very interesting case because it isn't a state per se. Uh, Moving away from Europe, there will be one on Israel, one we're looking forward to on Ethiopia, one we're looking forward to on Mexico. So there will be several books in the series, and I encourage you all to go to the website and have a look. So today, however, we will be focusing on the question of Japan with Professors Katada and Koga. It's a wonderful book. I had the privilege of working with them through this process, so I'm very familiar with the book itself, and I encourage you all to seek it out. We're going to spend the next hour or so dependent. Basically, we will ask the authors to make a presentation, 10 to 15 minutes perhaps, but 10 minutes most likely. Followed, we asked them to speak for 10 minutes. Do you know academics that will speak for only 10 minutes if given 10 minutes? So we will see. And then we will have a Q&A session, and the Q&A session is a cumulative process in which we've asked people to write in with some questions as well as devising some of our own. So we will offer a variety of different questions, both from people who have written in as well as ourselves. But I hope we'll have plenty of latitude. So at this point, I wish to express my thanks to Indu for organizing this event and Saori and Kai for participating in the event. And I will turn it over to them to begin with a few short slides. Welcome.
Can you hear it? Can you see it?
Yes, please. We can see it.
Okay. Yes. Professor
Yes.
Koga will start.
Okay, yeah, all right. Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind introduction, Indu and then Simon. And then we also greatly appreciate the consortium of the Indo-Pacific researchers for inviting us to this the online book talk. And today, the Professor Katada, Saori, and I will briefly introduce our book, Japan's Grand Strategy, which was published this March from the Oxford University Press's book series, edited by the three authors, including the Simon Reich, Professor Simon Reich. So we are pretty delighted to have this session. And so first half, I will discuss the broader conceptual and then theoretical dimensions of the book. And then the Saori will discuss Japan's contemporary strategy, particularly focusing on the Indo-Pacific ground strategy. So next slide, please. Does it? Okay, thank you so much. So in our book, we traced Japan's grand strategy from the Meiji period, which
Can you
began
see
in
it?
the
This is the second
18th.
page.
Yeah, yeah, I can see
Does
it.
it change?
Yeah, I can see it. So yes, in our book, we trace Japan's grand strategy from the Meiji period to which began in the 1868 to the 2025, and across these periods, more than the 150 years, we identify the two major characteristics of the Japan's grand strategy. And then first one is Japan is a liminal power in multiple ways. The term liminality refers to the in-betweenness, and then Japan has often found itself situated in between in terms of the capability, status, and also the geographical identity since the beginning of the modern era. And I will discuss this a bit more in the next slide. And then second one is Japan has developed the grand strategies over time, and this suggests that the grand strategy is not limited to the great powers, as the book series actually indicates. The too often grand strategy is discussed from the perspective of the superpowers, such as the United States and then most recently China. But their non-great powers, like their often their people they call the middle and small powers, also develop their grand strategies. And of course, they face the resource and then capability constraints or limitations, and then external conditions constrain their behavior. But they are even under such their conditions, they still have the room to maneuver. And next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So we identify the first liminality here. We identify three types of liminality in Japan's case: the capability liminality, status liminality, and then geographical liminality. And then what do we mean by this is that Japan has repeatedly experienced the different types of their material and then perceptual gaps throughout its modern history. So, for example, during the Cold War era, Japan experienced the capability liminality because its economic power did not automatically translated into the military powers due to the many the social, constitutional, and legal political constraints. And during the interwar period, back in the pre-World War II era, Japan faced status liminality as it sought recognition as the great power within the Western-led the international community, while also aspiring to become the Asia's leading power. And then at the end, Japan actually aimed to be the Asian power without actually being associated with the Western-led international community. So Japan has often, and also like often people actually indicate Japan has been torn between the East and West in terms of its political, economic, and social affiliations. And then at each historical moment, Japan attempts to make more use of this in-betweenness to pursue its national interests, whether economic or security related. And we consider this characteristic quite interesting, although we recognize that this typology is more descriptive than the analytical. And next slide, please. And then the question we often encounter relates to the grand strategy itself is does Japan actually have the grand strategy? Or like more broadly, can non-great power have their grand strategies? And then our answer is yes, as this again, like our book, series suggests, grand strategy can be defined as states plan to and practice to achieve its national goals by setting means and ways within the available resources. So if we employ this definition, it is entirely possible for non-great powers to have grand strategies, even though their strategic scope is more constrained by limited resources and external environment than that of the great powers. But in this sense, we argue that Japan has had the grand strategies and has exercised its agency in formulating them. And on this basis, we employ the theoretical framework of historical institutionalism, focusing on how and why Japan has shifted its grand strategy over time. And historical institutionalism is particularly useful because its analytical focus is on the continuity and change. That is how and why continuity and change occur. And more specifically, we use the concepts of the path dependence and also critical junctures. So our basic thesis is twofold. The one is first, when external shocks occur, which is the strategic environment changes, leaders have stronger incentive to shift strategy. And the second one is whether this strategic shift actually occurs depends on the domestic conditions, including the decision-making process and the number of the veto players internally. So based on this framework, we analyze Japan's shifts in the ground strategy from Meiji period to the present. And then from here, I'll pass it to the Professor Saori.
Right. So thank you, Kei. So I will follow up based on the framework that Kei just introduced to you of the empirics that we analyzed. As he said, we started from Meiji period, which for those who are not Japanese specialists, Meiji started in 1868. So we covered about more than 150 years, but our focus has been on the kind of changes over time. So one chapter is on the Meiji period, the other one was looked at inter-year period, and then third after the Japan's defeat in the World War II, so during the Cold War. So that's a historical chapter. What I would like to talk about, given that we have very little time, is to look at the Indo-Pacific grand strategy. So this is the second part of our empirical analysis, where we focus basically on the 21st century. And for 21st century, Japan's pursued what we call Indo-Pacific grand strategy. You might have heard of FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, which constitutes a part of this bigger Indo-Pacific grand strategy, which has four major characteristics. One, definitely, as you hear the sound and the name of it, it's instead of Asia Pacific or Asia, East Asia, and so on, this is Indo-Pacific grand strategy by emphasizing the broader coverage of the two oceans and also looking at China as the kind of competitive rising power and also keeping the US kind of engaged in this region. The second characteristics is that the Japanese government, Japanese state, other actors have pursued its diplomatic, security, and economic interests. So this is quite comprehensive way in which Japan engage with the rest of the world, especially the region, but beyond. And thirdly, this is not just, so everybody talks about FOIP, which was announced in 2016 by then Prime Minister Abe. But actually, this grand strategy emerged in bits and pieces in different phases, starting by the end of the Cold War. Actually, the first Gulf crisis of 1990-91 was one of the major external shocks that triggered Japan to start changing its ways from the checkbook diplomacy into much more engaged policies, like the engagement in the defense and then things like that. And finally, the kind of important part, and I will get there in a minute, is that it is very kind of one of the ways that this has been one of the ways that Japan contributes to public goods and rule-based order. So in order to achieve that type of goal, Japan has been engaging in coalition building, in a comprehensive and inclusive manner. So just in the last few minutes we have, let me just talk about how these national goals kind of formulated. So there are two strategic objectives on the part of the Japanese kind of national objectives in the Indo-Pacific Grand Strategy. One is the defense, national defense, so increasing kind of security threat and the kind of perception of Japan needing to step up. Deterrence has created one major pillar. The other pillar, which comes with the rise of China and the disinterest or declining commitment on the part of the United States to the public goods and international order, has been that led Japan to pursue strategic objective of maintaining and shaping international order. So given that there are four components that we looked at, so one definitely is the US-Japan alliance, which is kind of folded into the security matters. Second one is establishing regional order, especially in the economic field, but others. We emphasize the mega FTAs Japan has been successfully building. So third component is maritime security, especially the freedom of navigation and the way in which Japan is committing to many of the kind of maritime security issues with the regional partners. And finally, even though this is not regionally specified, but it's it's the provision of international public goods, things like peacekeeping operations, national disaster relief, as well as foreign aid, especially when it comes to infrastructure investment, as well as putting forward some of the important concepts like the human security. So just to wrap up, well, we would like to argue that we have made four major contributions through this publication of our book. One is the use, as Kei mentioned, use of the historical institutionalism in thinking about grand strategy studies. Second, again, as Kei introduced, this is the use of concept called liminal power in looking at Japan's grand strategy. Third contribution, we hope that we have comprehensive coverage of grand strategy, not only military, but from using the economic and diplomatic tools. The reason why we are the pair, Kei and me, Kei being the security person, me being the economic expert, this made this kind of combination possible and I think fully fledged. Finally, this was hopefully clear. If those who read the book, we have used extensive Japanese scholarship, especially in the field of diplomatic history. Japanese, there are a lot of excellent work, but not very much of it has been published in English. So we hope our book has contributed in bridging that type of gap between the scholarship in Japan and the English academic document like this one. So I will stop here and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much. I understand completely. It's very hard to cover, you spend years working on a book and then somebody says, tell me about it in 10 minutes. I mean, it's completely unreasonable. But it's the same at every conference we go to, so we shouldn't be surprised. I want to begin by emphasizing the last point that Saori made, which is about scholarship and its relationship to the series, which is one of the objectives of the series, is to find people who work in, live in, or from the particular countries that they study, rather than, dare I say, the usual American suspects who often articulate positions on these. And your point about scholarship and your reliance on Japanese sources that aren't used very much really amplifies that point and reinforces it. And it's a tremendous strength of the book. I want to begin by asking you to expound a little bit more for the audience on the concept of liminality. We have lots of questions that we want to get to about contemporary affairs and how your analysis fits in with various contemporary issues. But the when I was reading about your analysis of liminality, it reminded me that thinking about how Americans think about grand strategy, in which we think about controlling strategies, shaping strategies, and rather less about adaptive ones. And when you look at countries such as Japan, a good example of that, but many of the countries in the series, the real focus is on adaptation rather than control or shaping. So could you say, without stretching it too long, but could you say a little bit more for us about liminality and why you chose it and why you think it's so important that it applies in this context?
Okay, thank you. Kata Sensei, would you like to start?
No,
Yeah.
Kate, please. Go ahead.
No, yeah. So yes, thank you very much for the Simon. I just kind of really believe about it. The liminality actually is the concept that we've been thinking about since the beginning of the writing this book, because Japan always often evaluated as the country in between the West and the East. And also when we actually look at Japan's modern era, then the Japan started off from the really small country, which don't they didn't really have the strong defense capabilities or economic capabilities, but quickly rose the power to India, Asia. So we thought this kind of the change in the capability and change in the status and change in the geographical identity a really important part of the shaping the Japan's kind of grand strategies. And when we looked at the external environment really matters. So Japan is often considered as the adaptive state or the reactive state. But then when you look at into the really kind of detail, then Japan actually took the initiative to try to kind of shape the regional order and also the part of the international order in many ways. And then this actually was really interesting for our analysis. And then we kind of looked at the how this actually happened. And when we looked at it, then the in-betweenness Japan had in the international politics, which could be really the strengths to utilize in the doing so in the international setting. So this is why we came up with the concept of liminality. But then we haven't actually gone really in depth to theorize the liminality yet. So maybe this is going to be our next research project, and then we are trying to do it. So that's my kind of take.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's a very interesting concept, right? And not one that I've come across in the context much of international relations theory before. So certainly something to expound upon, and this sense of liminality probably applies beyond Japan in other contexts to other countries, and the shifting international environment where the notion of stability has been replaced rather more by that of fluidity. Some people alarmingly call this chaos, for example, especially realists who structure, arguments around notions of stability in different polarities and different distributions of power. This concept, I think, has a lot of legs on it. It's very interesting the way in which you've applied it, but certainly could be applied a lot more in other contexts. And I encourage people to read the book on that account alone. I'm going to shift tone rather, because I have a feeling that our audience is really interested in the topical and the applicable to the topical. And your slides were very good in talking about the context of this. But one question that I had and was echoed by many people who contacted us before this event concerned the question of how events in the East China Sea influence the government's choices about its budgets and its relations with China and the US, right? This is very much so. How can we? I'm always one for talking about how the rubber hits the road, as the Americans like to say, right? The applicability of this. how do you consider the relationship between the kind of analysis you provide and this very pressing, critical, topical question?
Could you
Okay.
take it? This is a security question, I guess.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Well,
So
I'm sorry,
the
just to clarify, it's easy for you to get away with saying the security question, but you know what? Everything in the United States, as you well know, is now security, right? Immigration, drugs, tariffs.
right. Good. Yeah. So yeah, the because of the the East China Sea involves in the particular kind of like the security perspective. I'll start off, and then you probably like the professor the Katada would actually chime in later on. But then the East China Sea the issue which was actually they highlighted in the 2010 2012 when the Japanese the Coast Guards got call it crashed with the Chinese the fishery ships, and also the Japanese government nationalized the Senkaku or Ryukyu Islands. Then like that actually created the big conflict and the tensions with the China, and that actually definitely created the traction for the Japanese government to increase the concern about the rise of China. In the I think big broader context, the 2008 kind of global financial crisis happened, and then that was kind of hinted relative decline of the United States, and then the U.S. was actually not like playing the sufficient role to deter or like the maintain the stability in the East Asia. So those are the kind of like the concern that Japan had at the time. And then if you actually look at Japan's defense policy, guidelines, then they actually indicated influence of the United States is kind of like in decline, and we need to actually do more. So that actually again like propelled the Japanese government to increase their security the role in the region, particularly for the national security, the defense and in Senkaku or like East China Sea in that sense. But then over time, like this actually has broader implications because it's not only the East China Sea, but also like it actually is something to do with the economic security. China actually started engage kind of economic sanctions on rare earths, and also China started to use the narrative that Japan is actually upsetting the status quo in the East China Sea, and then the China on that basis tried to create the defense air defense the ADIS, the air defense identification zone in the East China Sea too. So all these kind of the things, the situation actually created the Japan to increase more their defense, their budget, and also their security role in the region, in the East Asia, and then the beyond, so that the Japan came up with the Indo-Pacific strategy. So external shock was probably like 2008 to 2012, in the global financial crisis, the East China Sea conflicts. And then within the Japanese politics, Japanese leaders kind of decided to push forward. It's more kind of like the proactive, the diplomacy, as well as the increase in the defense capabilities to manage its own defense. So that's the kind of like the whole broader setting of the East China Sea conflict, I think.
Yeah, and if I can just follow up briefly. So how do how does the Japanese government, I mean, we've been reading a lot about increase in defense budgets, for example, right? And not just increase in defense budgets, but shifts in the defense doctrine, right? Which is closer to your analysis of grand strategy, right? I mean, it
Right.
has more relationship to it. Do you think that, I mean, we'll come on to the economic section, sorry, you don't escape, right? We're coming on to the question of how Japan deals with the trade tariff regime and the unraveling of the international order, at least as we've known it, whether it's unraveling or whether it's evolving is a question mark. But the question is faced with these two dilemmas, right? The changes in the defense doctrine on the one hand, and the shift in the economic environment on the other. What does this tell us individually about these two components? And what does it tell us about the strategy? I mean, in the book, you talk about options for the future. This is one of the questions where we seem to be at whether you want to call it a pivotal point, a tipping point. I'm always a little wary. Scholars always talk about these things. Oh, this is a tipping point. That is a tipping point. Everything changes. Nothing remains the same. So I'm always a little suspicious about that. But how does this fit into the contemporary strategy as you've described it and the prospects for the strategy moving forward?
So in many ways, our the analysis of Indo-Pacific ground strategy, there was a lot of these external shocks that we didn't call like one place a tipping point, as Kei kind of described. There are series of things like the global financial crisis, some of the issues in the East China Sea, as well as East China Sea has many dimensions to it. So that's how we looked at different issue areas. Right. But overall, for Japan, the stability and the kind of basis for prosperity is the foundation of it. And for it, the rule-based order has been very critical. So, that's both in terms of kind of, both in terms of the security issues as well as kind of economic issues. And as the United States, and maybe putting more contemporary spin to it, especially the Trump 2.0, really violates some of the foundation of the rule-based order or liberal kind of system. This really heightens the emphasis for the Japanese state to really make sure that one, it kind of put forward many of these rules in place and kind of systems that could actually underwrite these rules. That's one. But at the same time, Japan alone cannot do it. Right, that's very clear. So it's the coalition building, and in most cases, because China engages in economic coercion, engages in some of the kind of aggressive military actions, this kind of becomes a way in which kind of in which containing China becomes one of the goals. But at this moving farther on, I don't think I think Kei and I both agree that Japan cannot exclude Japan cannot balance against the US. That's not what Japan is trying to do. Meanwhile, I think it's important that now some of the rules that's been basically ditched by the American kind of declining hegemony has to be provided by some of the coalition building among the partners around the region. So that's the kind of putting more the contemporary context to what's going on.
And looking forward, right, this notion of liminality and in-betweenness, shall we say, never applies more strongly than if you think about the geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions between the fact that that Japan exists under the American security umbrella, but its biggest trading partner remains China. And how do you think that they will manage the tension between the two? I mean, Japan is not alone in this. When I listed the books before that are coming out, I forgot to mention, shame on me, Andrew Yao's book is coming out on South Korea, and we see similar problems, right, in that context, right, with the management of the two. How do the Japanese think about a strategy that manages this tension effectively? A lot of the literature just talks about hedging, but to be honest with you, that doesn't get me very far, because the concept of hedging has expanded so much in the recent literature. I mean, there's great literature on hedging. I'm not disparaging that, but the concept which, Kai, I know you've written about, I've read your stuff on hedging. So it's expanded, the concept of it expanded so much that it's losing its utility. So I don't want to say how does Japan hedge because that seems a problem to me, but how does Japan manage this tension?
I think many
Okay.
ways, but so if I start from the kind of area that I looked into is building institutions, minilateralism, plurilateralism, and CPTPP, RCEP, all those things Japan is in the middle of, and obviously some of them actually have, some of them, well, many of them don't have the US in it. Some of them have China in it, and kind of engaging, kind of creating web of institutions, which some of them might not survive, but creating that environment where, again, coalition can be built in relatively flexible way is one way Japan is, I don't know if it's called hedging, but I think proactively engaging with this uncertainty. And again, it's not clearly like one way or the other, but this is the way in which Japan is investing into creating that type of more stable and possible way forward.
Right, right. So in that sense, the tentacles of regionalism and multilateralism are rerouting rather than disappearing.
That's what I know. That's what we saw in this kind of analysis.
Which is a very interesting finding because, of course, I think it's interesting. I agree with you completely, right? But I'm sure that, there are many people who talk about the decline of the liberal international order rather than its reconstitution in other forms, whether it's at the regional level, and that's what you're clearly describing here. Kai, did you want to add something at this point? Oh, sorry. If
No, it's okay. So,
Yeah.
I think the big multilateralism seems to have most difficulty, like WTO and all that, right? So anyway, I'll give the floor to Kate.
Kai.
Okay, just really quickly, I think yeah, the hedging, I mean, like the concept of hedging is so expanded, so that yeah, it's kind of like hard to actually say that. But then the one way that like Japan is trying to do is kind of trying to build the coalition with the many partners, as the Saori said. And then I guess in the defense sense, that's the same. But then one thing probably like the Japan is trying to do is Japan is trying to make those kind of the coalition more and more kind of inclusive now that Japan is not like really completely relying on the United States for its defense and so on and so forth. So I guess the coalition building are there, and then like they are trying to create a certain kind of network, but then rather than kind of like a value-based network, the emphasize in liberal international order like before, it's more like the coalition on the basis of their particular interests, but at the same time on the particular kind of Japan is trying to nudge their liberal value is still important, and then trying to kind of persuade the other countries to be in the line aligned with the liberal order. But then that was actually getting like weaker, I think. Like that's a kind of like the status. And then but like then the one thing that Japan is trying to do is again like the coalition building.
Yes, and of course the Quad presumably plays a role in it, but the trouble with organizations, even like the Quad, is that it's foundationally it's reliant on American credibility, trust, and goodwill, and that
Right.
seems to be disappearing fast. So even embryonic organizations like that suffer as a result, presumably.
Right. So they are actually probably like playing their kind of yeah, not disappearing, I would say, but then they are playing the smaller role, like in terms of the regional architecture building. But
Yeah.
yeah, at the same time, Japan is now like trying to strengthen the tie with the other the powers, like regional powers, like uh, Australia, like as we could actually see today. They are trying to strengthen the tie in terms of the economic security, And also they are trying to reach out some of the ASEAN countries in order to build the new network for their economic security, supply chain resilience, and then their energy security as well. So I think like these are coalition is not like really formalized, but then I think like it's more kind of fluid. And then when like they face the new kind of situation, they try to strengthen the particular the ties with the non-great powers so that like they could have a little bit more resiliency, like in terms of securing the position and then the interest.
Yeah, I have a ton of questions, but I'm going to interrupt my ton of questions with one that came from Brendan Donnelly, who's in the audience, who asked if there is, very modestly asked if there's time for my question. In Dr. Koga and Dr. Katada's opinion, what would be the considered Japan's strategic economic, quote, red lines that, if impacted or restrained, would lead to the Japanese government considering military responses to maintain the goals of a free and open Indo-Pacific? Not a small question, right? But what, if I may slightly amend it, what are Japan's red lines? Adaptation, liminality, etc., suggests a certain mobility and fluidity, but we've seen a succession, for example, of Chinese claims about islands, etc., and the Japanese government has changes have been critical junctures, incremental. Are there any red lines for the Japanese today, do you think?
So to me, so this is not part of the book, but I guess extension of the book, I guess we are
Right.
trying to think about. I mean, definitely one maybe red line, not in some ways, kind of a reverse way of thinking about it is that US-Japan alliance. If the US says no more alliance, Japan will change drastically. That's for sure. I don't know, I don't know what Kei thinks. I mean, other ways, obviously, territorial integrity and all that is critical. I think in Japan, if Japan gets invaded, that's definitely a red line. But short of that, I think end of alliance would be a red line. What do you think, Kei?
No, I agree. I think the end of the U.S.-Japan alliance is going to be the big impact on everything, like the Japan's kind of security posture, Japanese diplomatic posture, and then also like the economic posture as well. So in that sense, yeah, that creates more important like impact on Japan's overall grand strategy because Japan's grand strategy, as we kind of discussed like in the book, one of the main pillar of Japan's defense is actually the U.S.-Japan alliance. But then it also kind of depends on how we are actually seeing I mean, if there is like the end of the U.S.-Japan alliance too. So if it's gradual, then there's a kind of like gradual transition. Japan is trying to strengthen tie with the other countries, and then they are trying to strengthen their defense capability, like the GCAP. With Italy and also the United Kingdom, and then maybe like these kind of like efforts going to be more to be seen. And but if it's going to be abrupt, like the United States suddenly said we're gonna be ending the alliance, then there's gonna be a big upset. I think like there's gonna be more kind of the different approach for Japan to take to China. And then in that sense, we were not really sure which direction like we are going. Like we are not like really seeing the possibility of ending the U.S.-Japan alliance abruptly. But then if this happens, then there's I think like the two ways. Like one is strengthening its own kind of defense capability with considering the nuclear weapons, and then the other one is accommodating the China.
Yes.
Those are kind of two extremes. But then I guess like these are
I mean,
the somewhere between.
the idea of ending the alliance, it sounds something like out of a fiction novel until 18 months ago. But now all things are possible.
Yeah,
I think,
can I add one more thing? Because I think Brandon's question is talking about economic red line. So if I may just add one
please.
more thing
Please.
One more thing is the energy, right? So now the Iran situation, now it seems to have stabilized at least for the time being. But if this becomes the total cutoff of the petroleum coming from the Middle East for Japan, that which Japan relies on 90% of their petroleum, I mean the oil, oil use. This will really be a big economic red line. Japan, from what I heard, Japan has 250 days of reserve, the stockpiling around it. That's why Japanese, gas price, even though it has gone up, hasn't gone as much up as other smaller states like Vietnam or Philippines. But again, the vulnerability is paramount.
And how does that vulnerability in play into when we start talking about the economic dimensions of this beyond the oil? The tariff regime, for example. I mean, the Japanese car exports to the United States is still a major market for Japanese companies. As we saw last week, despite the Supreme Court's rulings, Trump feels comfortable issuing 25% tariffs on EU cars. Um, the same kind of, I mean, the Japanese firms have the same kind of vulnerability. Uh, what are the economic red lines there in terms of how the Japanese will adapt in the context of the United States, potentially at least not no longer being the major market it has been?
Well, so I don't know about the red line. Obviously now Japan's economic relationship with the US is through investment rather than simply trade. As you probably heard, Japan is about to invest or investing $550 billion to the US in response to the tariff negotiation that they had back in the summertime, right? So that kind of abuse of that would be a red line. Obviously, at this point, the Japanese government seems to be totally in support of it. Whether it's going to actually be implemented fully, I'm very much, very much doubt because it's such a large amount. Meanwhile, Japan has been the largest investor in the US for the last, what is it, 6 years, I believe. So, that type of relationship is going to continue to be very, very close. Meanwhile, targeting Japan kind of in the national, what is it? Japan as a national, kind of target, if that is to happen, then that's going to be really a red line. At this point, 10%, 20% tariff is still survivable for Japanese companies as long as there are windows for massive investment and make quite a bit of business there. Again, how much they can do is questionable, but that's one thing. Hopefully, now just kind of coming back to the energy situation, the US and Japan will get closer because US can actually export LNG and petroleum and all those things to Japan. So that's kind of an interesting flip side to the red line.
Yes, yes, absolutely. In the remaining time that I mean, I have lots of questions, but in the remaining time we have, I just want to ensure that we look a little bit forward. We've been talking about history, then we talked about, oh, these are the current issues, but moving forward. So, when I'm an amateur, right? When it comes to Japan, completely an amateur. I visited Japan a half dozen times. I wrote a little bit with Ellis Krauss about Japan many years ago about US-Japanese relations. But today when I read about Japan, I read about demographic crises, aging population. I read about these economic pressures, et cetera, et cetera. We social scientists are terrible at prediction. right? Everybody wants to predict, and and I read years later about the predictions that people made and how wild they are, but their careers still seem to thrive. I don't understand how this process works. So I will not ask you to predict. I won't put you on the hot seat. But what are the options for Japan moving forward? In your minds, what are the two, three possibilities in terms of its strategy? And you've already hinted at what some of the key factors are that will determine that. But, you know, Trump is 2028. Yes, and he may want to try and stay on longer, and he may want to try and anoint a successor, but American politics moves like a pendulum, right? So we have no idea about that. But in the Japanese context, what are the two or three major futures that you see economically, security, demographically, however you depict them? You have rare insight, the two of you, and I just want our audience to be left with a sense of how you see things.
So may I just start with the kind of security perspective and then also the couple of the futures. The one is I mean, obviously status quo. Try to actually strengthen the tie with the United States. And then that's a plan B. I mean, like, whatever happened, the US and Japan kind of defense capabilities are pretty much coordinated, and then they want to strengthen it. And like this kind of turbulence under the Trump administration might be temporary, so that the Japan actually could bet on the United States, and then so that like the to fullest extent they want to strengthen tie with the United States. That's kind of traditional. But then the alternatives, like the second one is the plan B, is that like the U.S. might not actually engage as much as it used to be to the defense of Japan or the region. Then the Japan actually really have to shift the gears to strengthen the tie with the so-called like-minded countries, like middle powers and then small powers or non-great powers in the region. Particularly the I think the democratic countries in Asia, Australia, maybe like Philippines, and then to some extent the other like-minded countries sharing their similar interests, Singapore, Vietnam, etc. And then creating those kind of coalitions, trying to reduce the dependence on the United States, and then try to kind of strengthen or like they are more kind of engaging with the China to manage the risk of being the coerced by the China. And the third one is completely they may actually choose to accommodate China, like if there's no option available. That's kind of like the future. Probably like we could actually we are not going to see much, but then those are three kind of possible scenarios.
Can I push you,
And
Kai,
yeah,
before we move to sorry, can I
sure.
push you on the last one, which is the accommodation to China? And what how would you characterize the prospects? What forms would it take, or what issues would it take? I noticed, by the way, in your long list of countries, you never mentioned South Korea. It was the
Okay,
one.
yeah. So
It was the one that you omitted, and I didn't know whether that was for
no,
political
no,
reasons, historical reasons, or just cognitive dissonance. But you didn't
sorry.
mention the South
Yeah.
Koreans, which seems an obvious pairing, but let me go back to my first point before I move to Saori, which is accommodation. What does that look like? Giving up claims to islands, giving, okay, I don't want to offer prognoses. You're much better qualified to do that than me. But what would it look like?
So it looks like I think it's under the condition probably US-Japan alliance is not completely working anymore. And then I think accommodation meaning obviously yeah, I mean territorial the claim like over the Eastern Sea, like more compromise, more concessions. And also the more like the concessions over the Taiwan Straits. And then these are the things that the Japan kind of like try to accommodate China by incorporating some of their insistent or their claims that like the China pushed forward for a long time. So I guess that is the kind of concession to accept the part of the China-led order, like in the East Asia.
But not militarism. You did not list that as an
No
option, unless I
military.
misunderstood. That for the Japanese, I mean, there are people on the right in Japan, right, who would, say, well, we need to move from a self-defense doctrine, and the strategic shifts in the strategic doctrine and purchasing that we've seen in the last year suggests some more, I don't want to say aggressive because it's not more aggressive, but a more stout resistance, et cetera, et cetera. But there's no circumstances under which you'd see it shifting towards a more aggressive posture.
I think the aggressive posture could happen like when Japan could actually sufficiently build the coalition with the like-minded countries. If the Australia or other Southeast Asian countries like support Japan to be stronger, and then Japan to be the more kind of defense oriented, and then deter against the China's kind of assertiveness, maybe that could happen. But then if there's no support for the Japanese, going this kind of directions. Japan has faced the really hard choice, and that could include the accommodation to China. Also, I think like that these are the things that like the what I see the second choice and third choice. I think it depends on the first choice and also like the international circumstances of the day. So first, like U.S.-Japan alliance, and then like the how much like coalition Japan could build, and then like we will see what kind of direction Japan is going to pursue.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I'm old enough to remember when Americans were outraged when Japanese owners bought Pebble Beach Golf Course. And people thought that this was the end of the American great power strategy as we knew it, and this was in the 1990s. And
Yeah, Rockefeller Center and all that.
And people would write absurd books with titles like The Coming Hegemonic War with Japan. And in fact, the only thing that makes me feel better is they used exactly the same kind of analysis and exactly the same language as they use in discussing China today, which makes me feel that maybe it's a little bit overwrought. But yes, the Japanese are huge foreign investors in the United States. Absolutely. But more broadly, what are the options for Japan's future? We look at the European case and we see the European economy, especially the German economy, in all kinds of problems now. What's happening with what's the future look like for Japan in this regard?
Yeah, so the Japanese, again, looking at more from the economic side, Japan's challenge is balancing between a very, very kind of two forces that are not actually compatible. One is the economic integration, which Japan needs in many ways, energy, population, market and all that. So that's one side, but economic security on the other hand, right? So both of them, economic security tend to separate, while the economic integration obviously tend to integrate. And Japan has to kind of manage both both forces. And that's where Japan is. And, it's kind of true for, even in relation to China. I mean, I don't think Japan can ever decouple from China economically, right?
Ever.
While, integrating China, like, CPTPP, China wants in since, what is it, September of 2021. And,
Right.
Japan has been like, everybody has been like, kind of, trying to push all these things back but somewhere along the way, decision has to come. So this whole conflicting demand is where Japan sits, and I don't think it will change anytime soon. Meanwhile, I think what's new and what's kind of exciting or depressing in some ways is that economic security is now the kind of concern number one, especially for Takaichi government now. She just announced this updating of FOIP. And really, economic security concern. I mean, there are other things. Obviously, even the defense type of issue has been raised, but economic security is really an important topic for Japan now.
Right, right. And which seems to be a concern that's not just of the Japanese, but expands well beyond Japan, throughout the region and throughout and into the United States and Europe. So that's a universal concern. Sadly, we have come to the end of our hour. I have a list of questions in front of me, and I literally have got through less than half of them. So, which of course offers us the prospect of a future engagement of this type, where we're looking at things like Japan as an international actor in terms of its contributions to dealing with collective action issues, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope I'm not being too presumptuous when I suggest that we do a return meeting in the not too distant future. I want to personally thank you and once again congratulate you on a wonderful book. And I hope that people listening to this will look for the book at Oxford University Press on the Oxford series on grand strategy. And for any latecomers, I once again raise the book to show it to them. It's a marvelous book that I strongly encourage you to read. And at this point, I hand the chair back to Indu with my many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Reich. That is a wonderful session, and you steered so well this conversation that inspire the listeners to get the book and read the book. And Professor Saori and Dr. Koga, that's a wonderful talk, and your candid response really were amazing, and it's totally we loved the discussion. It was fascinating, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And thank you, Simon.